Listo. ¿Listo? Bueno, pues buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Voy a introducir a nuestro invitado del día de hoy, del seminario extraordinario del día de hoy. Él es David Posner, es mexicano de nacimiento. Aunque se ha formado en el extranjero, bueno, David nació en México, hizo la licenciatura en Nueva York, trabajando con productos naturales y antibióticos de hongos. Y actualmente está haciendo un doctorado en la Universidad de Cambridge, que es lo que viene a platicarnos el día de hoy, trabajando en neuroinmunología. La idea del seminario es que David nos comparta su experiencia. Es importante, creo, para la comunidad estudiantil, sobre todo, que sepan que existen estas oportunidades de intercambio académico, no solo para hacer estancias cortas, sino también para desarrollar estudios de doctorado en el extranjero. Y bueno, también nos puede hablar un poquito de qué posibilidades podría haber de que gente trabajando en México pueda enviar estudiantes a Cambridge y que incluso se establezcan colaboraciones pues a corto y largo plazo. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias, David. Todavía no se titula, David está por recibirse de doctor, esperemos en los próximos meses, pero bueno, somos todo oídos. Y muchas gracias, David, por tu seminario.
Muchas gracias por la muy amable introducción y por la invitación. Es un honor estar pues platicando con ustedes. Voy a hacer el switch a inglés porque no, no soy muy bueno dando charlas de ciencia de comunicación en español. Pero si tienen alguna pregunta, ya sea en inglés o en español, por favor, nada más pueden alzar la mano o lo que sea y yo contento lo respondo. Okay, so I'll be talking to you about two things today. So as Paula said, my name is David, and I'm from I'm finishing my PhD in the Department of Medicine, and I'm here to kind of talk to PIs and to students about potentially sending students for kind of short-term collaborations, or if you're an undergrad or master's student and want to do a PhD abroad, how to do that. So this is a picture of the institute that I've been lucky enough to do my PhD in. It's called the MRC-LMB. It's in the hospital campus, and right here under the arrow is where my office is. It's a stunning building and it's a wonderful place to work. Cambridge, for reference, is 1 hour away from London in the UK. But as Paula said, I'm originally from Morelia. But then I went to San Francisco to finish my high school diploma before going to New York for university, and then moving via lots of places to the UK. So I've got kind of lots of experience moving around and using kind of academic opportunities to move around and kind of live different places and see the world. So I kind of wanted to share that a bit. But first, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been doing, just so if you're kind of interested in coming to Cambridge or what have you, you have an idea of like what the type of work that's going on. So my PhD's been on kind of adaptive immunity. I'm more of an immunologist than a neuroscientist, but I kind of my work is between the two. And basically I've been looking at how the adaptive immune response plays a role in Parkinson's. Just for background, Parkinson's affects over 9 million people worldwide, and it's the second most common neurodegenerative disease after Alzheimer's disease. It basically happens, it's a disease that affects the brain naturally, particularly in this area of the brain called the midbrain. There's this area called the substantia nigra, which houses the largest reservoir of dopaminergic neurons that express dopamine. And in a healthy patient, these are kind of completely normal and functional, but in the Parkinsonian brain, these neurons die, and the reason why is still not very clear. But what we do know is that they accumulate, these and other neurons along the brain accumulate these protein inclusions or clusters called alpha-synuclein, of a protein called alpha-synuclein, similar to amyloid kind of fibrils and so in Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases. When these neurons die, that's when patients start to get motor symptoms and non-motor symptoms. So things like tremors, which are quite famous, sleep disturbances, GI symptoms, and cognitive impairment like depression, anxiety. But what's not been clear in the field has is what the role of the immune system is, and there's some clues in the literature, like GWAS studies and a few studies in the past few years, but nothing really conclusively showing the role of the immune system in PD. So that's kind of where the story started. But there was one key thing that our lab thought that the field had been missing, and that was the incorporation of this tissue called the meninges in kind of the pathology and in the picture. The meninges are a connective tissue that surround the brain and the spinal cord. They're made of three different layers: the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. And here you're looking at a kind of cartoon of a cross section of a human head, where you have the brain, so the gray matter here, the white matter, and right outside the brain you have the pia, the arachnoid, and the dura matter. And then after the dura is the skull, and so on. And for the past few years, well, for many, many years, people just thought, especially doctors, just thought that the meninges were a physical barrier to protect the brain, and nothing else was going on. But since kind of 2012 until now, people have been studying the meninges and the role of immunity there. And it turns out there's, thousands and thousands of different immune cells, things like B cells here in B20, CD3 T cells, F480 macrophages, tissue resident macrophages, an array of monocytes, DCs, and what have you. Any immune cell that exists is present here in homeostasis. And so with this kind of clue in mind, we decided to look at how the meninges fits into pathology, and how maybe it's playing a role in an autoimmune component in PD. So the first thing that we did, using a mouse model of Parkinson's, was look at the brain, and we're able to capture, in several instances, T cells making cell-to-cell contact with these dopaminergic neurons in the midbrain of these mice. And when we quantify the microscopy data, we could see that there's an accumulation of T cells in this area. And then when we looked at the meninges, and here just for reference is, we can basically dissect them off of a mouse skull and put it flat on a microscopy slide, and they kind of look like this, where these blue lines are the blood vessels that run through the meninges, and the rest of it is non-vessel tissue. And in the control mouse, we basically have the blood vessels, a number of B cells here in pink, T cells in green, which is normal. But in a Parkinson's mice, you can see that the number of these is like greatly increased, and they form these little clusters of T cells and B cells that look like tertiary lymphoid structures, and they sit outside the blood vessels, which you can appreciate here. When we quantify that, kind of long story short, when we do some quantification by flow, we can see that the immune cells in the brain and in the meninges basically are identical in kind of in landscape. So we can see, increase in T cells, CD4s, particularly within the CD4s, there's a dominant phenotype is the type 1 immunity, so Th1s. Similar in the CD8 compartment, we can also see T-bit expressing CD8 T cells, but not the presence of Th17 or TC17. And this occurs kind of from very, very early on in the mouse, and remains chronic for about 20 months. We wanted to then understand what the role of antigen presentation was in this phenotype, because antigen presenting cells activate T cells. And so when we looked at the meninges for antigen presenting cells here in green, we can see there's a vast network of them. In this case, these are all macrophages. But in the PD model, we could see these little clusters of APCs. And when we zoom into them and look for T cells as well, we can see that they colocalize into these three-dimensional lymphoid structures. And they look quite angry, and the T cells are definitely engaging in cell-cell communication and are quite active and mobile. And you can see these little projections in this image on the right. We try to find out where the T cells were coming into the brain. We still don't really know, and nobody's been able to show that. But there's some evidence showing that maybe the choroid plexus is the place where they get honed to, and they enter the brain. And we can see that in the choroid plexus here, this little squiggly tissue in the coronal sections of the brain. We can see loads of immune cells in both the control and the PD mouse. Most of the immune cells here are these antigen presenting cells that are tissue resident macrophages that are self-renewing, and they can attract lots of leukocytes here in red. But what was curious about the PD mouse was that a lot of those leukocytes were T cells here, you can see in pink. And you can appreciate that a little bit better with this kind of high res imaging, where these tissue resident macrophages are kind of really set in the tissue, and they can communicate with these little blue T cells via well, theoretically via MHC class 2, and present antigen directly from the brain there. Um, and so then we kind of came up with this hypothesis where we thought, okay, maybe this CNS antigen from the brain was filtering through the CSF and entering the meninges. And once it was there, it was captured by antigen presenting cells, presented to T cells, and that led to the priming of a T cell immune response in the form of these tertiary lymphoid structures. And to test that, we injected a mouse we injected the ventricles of a mouse with ova, and this is an OT2 mouse, so all the T cells are specific against ova albumin. We injected into the brain, and then we waited 2 weeks and then harvested the meninges for flow. And we could see that the total number of MHC class 2 antigen presenting cells of the total CD11B percentage population was significantly increased. And not only that, but the number of proliferating T cells was significantly increased as well. And when we look by imaging, we could see that, in fact, they formed tertiary lymphoid structures 2 weeks after challenge. This is at the site of injection, but here also in along the sinus and this other area of the meninges, we can see these three-dimensional clusters of proliferating T cells. Kind of long story short as well, we basically asked kind of what their function was, and we could see that they secrete more interferon gamma and a little bit more IL-17. There's more of them. They can actually secrete it, and we can measure that by ELISA. And when we do bulk RNA sequencing of the meninges, we can see that the interferon gamma response is significantly up, where all the genes here are significantly upregulated genes. We then thought maybe the brain was sensing that interferon gamma, that's what's pushing pathology, and we're correct. So when we looked at microglia by bulk RNA-seq, we can see that the microglia and PD have this interferon gamma response increased, and disease-associated kind of gene set enrichment was also increased. By flow, we can tell that they secrete more of their kind of classic cytokine TNF alpha, which we know is neurotoxic, and that's significantly increased both by flow and the secreted form by ELISA. And that leads us to kind of our final model, where we think that dying neurons in the brain are releasing alpha-synuclein or maybe another antigen. It gets washed up from the brain into the meninges, where normally brain waste goes. The rich network of antigen presenting cells here in the meninges captures those and then primes a T cell immune response, which is basically skewed to a type 1 response via the secretion of IL-12, which I didn't show. And that leads to more production of gamma, and we think there's a positive kind of regulation loop here. Here, we hypothesize that these T cells are entering the brain, and through the secretion of gamma are polarizing different cell types like astrocytes and microglia, which can then turn on cytokines like TNF, which drive neurotoxicity directly. And then potentially there might be a role for T cells directly engaging with kind of cell-cell communication with these neurons and then leading to their death. With that, I'd just like to kind of thank people in the lab who've helped. It's been a really fun project to work on. I'd be happy to take any questions about the science now. If not, I'll jump straight into the next part of the talk.
Yo tengo una pregunta, David.
Adelante.
Estos clústeres que veías de Bes con Ts en las meninges, ¿son como tal folículos? ¿Hay producción de anticuerpos ahí? ¿Qué papel tienen los autoanticuerpos si es que hay en impartido?
En este contexto, no sé si producen anticuerpos, pero acabamos de publicar un artículo que dice que estos como lymphoid aggregates en las meninges sí pueden producir. Es como they're home to like, specific B cell antigen responses that lead to plasma cell production. There's IL-21, there's TFH, all of that. In this case, I haven't fully characterized that part of the pathology because I've decided to look at it in an earlier kind of window. But we think that likely that is the case because in patients with PD, there has been reports of autoantibody production, but people haven't really known where they're coming from. And we think that this is the kind of perfect place for those responses to happen.
Y la tinción de anti-CD3 también te podría teñir NKTs. ¿No hay NKTs ahí?
Sí hay, pero muy, muy, muy poquitas. Y por single cell lo checamos y sí son 100% alpha beta T cells.
No sé si alguien más del público tiene preguntas de esta parte. Bueno, igual si no, al final pueden preguntar.
Perfecto. Hay algo, igual hay uno en el chat. ¿Qué modelo se utilizó para los ratones? Este es un modelo que se llama el MI2-BAC, que lo creó una PI de Cambridge, se llama María Spiantini. Ella es la que descubrió que alfa-sinucleína es la proteína que está dentro de los Lewy bodies en pacientes con Parkinson's. Ella creó como los ratones y no creo que los ha comercializado, entonces nada más por estar en el mismo departamento no los prestó y entonces vimos el fenotipo. Pero hay otro ratón y la razón, o sea, eso es muy crítico porque la mayoría de modelos de ratón son muy como sintéticos, si es la palabra correcta, como no hacen como el recapitulation del fenotipo de que se mueren las neuronas y qué pasa espontáneamente y qué pasa con 10 20 meses de progresión. Entonces, este modelo como que nos funcionó muy bien como para investigar esa área del desarrollo de una respuesta inmunológica y no nada más del mecanismo de cómo se mueran las neuronas y todo eso.
Oye, David, nada más una cosa más se me ocurrió.
Sí.
¿Qué tanto del efecto neurotóxico depende realmente de TNF? O sea, si tienes knockouts del receptor de TNF en las neuronas, ¿no hay muerte?
Solo hay un estudio que ha hecho eso y lo hicieron en como en los noventas y lo hicieron de una forma muy cruda, pero básicamente si haces como, if you deplete that receptor, basically, the pathology is less. Um, there's also really interesting studies. So there's this idea that PD pathology actually comes from the gut and that synuclein aggregates form in the gut and then they move to the brain via the vagus nerve. And that's not been really kind of well elucidated fully. But what's really interesting is that patients who have Crohn's disease or colitis in any way are more likely to develop Parkinson's disease. And this is a study in New England Journal of Medicine. And if those patients are treated with the kind of classic TNF inhibitors for colitis, their likelihood of getting PD is basically super, super reduced. So there definitely is a role for peripheral inflammation and TNF signaling in this neuronal death. But exactly what that is kind of hard to tell. We wanted to do some of like, using anti-TNF antibodies to kind of reduce pathology here, but the antibodies were so expensive that we weren't able to do that. But yeah.
Gracias.
Ok, voy a continuar con la segunda parte si alguien tiene una pregunta ahí la pueden poner en el chat. Okay, so this is the part where I'll talk to you about kind of my experience applying for CONACYT PhD student award to come to Cambridge, and how it's much more simple than you think, but it's also kind of logistically a bit complicated. Um, Okay, so basically, there's basically kind of 7 steps. So the first step is getting in touch with the PI that you're interested in, and this is really up to the kind of student to do some of the research to maybe understand what area of research you're interested in doing yourself, and then looking at PIs in Cambridge that are doing that sort of work, getting in touch with them, and then having some sort of verbal agreement that they're kind of happy to help you apply for the grant and you can apply for their lab and that's fairly simple to do and just takes a little bit of reading.
David, solo una cosa rapidísima. ¿Sabes si
Ajá.
esta convocatoria sigue vigente?
Sí, sigue vigente. Y además, porque sé que hay problemas con la cita ahorita, pero yo sé que el Cambridge Trust, que es la organización en Cambridge que que lidia con esta beca en específico, ellos están firmando un contrato para renovarlo por otros 5 años.
Ok,
Pero
es
sí,
importante porque han
en lo
cambiado
que
muchas cosas en CONACYT y ahorita entró una administración nueva, entonces solo para estar seguros que los chicos tienen opciones para
sí. Sí, sí, sí. Y lo bueno es que hay muchas otras becas y también voy a hablar de eso, pero esta es como la forma en la que yo saqué dinero, entonces pues comparto esa experiencia, pero sí hay muchas más becas para estudiantes mexicanos. Right. The second thing is that once you basically form this agreement with that potential PI, and then you apply to Cambridge to join the lab, you go through the application process to apply to that department where your PI is based in. Hopefully you'll secure an interview and get accepted. And using that letter of acceptance and a few other things, you'll then apply to the CONACYT scholarship, and then you'll hopefully get that award and then start your PhD the year after. The timeline is kind of as follows. Also, I'll be sharing these slides with Paula, so she'll be able to kind of share this with you guys, so you don't have to necessarily take notes at the moment. So basically, it's not ideally you can start basically like the year and a half before. So now is kind of a little bit after the summer of 2024. But you could feasibly apply or start looking at applying now for the next cycle to start in 2025. You want to start reading information kind of now, scheduling your IELTS exam, which they require both for CONACYT and for Cambridge, and then having an A firma from the SAT here in Mexico. You want to start with kind of getting in touch with PIs, doing some reading, and then want to put your application into Cambridge by November. It's due, I think, maybe mid-December. I'm not fully sure. You then kind of wait to be interviewed, wait for your PhD acceptance letter, and then you start preparing your materials for CONACYT, and that's in the February to March window. You'll then want to submit your CONACYT application from March to May. CONACYT then publishes the results kind of in August. This can vary from year to year depending on how CONACYT is working. I'm not really sure about that side of things. This can cause a few issues, but as long as you're on top of things and communicating with Cambridge and communicating with CONACYT, hopefully this won't be that bad of an issue and can be solved. Then if you are lucky enough to get a scholarship, you can then move to Cambridge and start your PhD in October. And that's kind of summarized here. There's a number of useful links, all of which I basically just Googled, but I thought I'd put them in just for kind of ease of access. There's a CONACYT website which has all the becas de posgrados. This is a quite complicated website, so I would just directly suggest Googling kind of beca de posgrado en el extranjero, doctorado directo, doctorado indirecto en el extranjero is kind of the keywords. You'll want to look at the kind of postgraduate study websites in Cambridge and look at applying and all the application deadlines. There's this course directory, which is really useful. So if you wanted to see what PhD programs are available, which departments are available, you can do that through here. The IELTS test centers, there's loads in Mexico City, there's loads all around Mexico, but just make sure that you've got this booked in with kind of anticipo, so that if you don't get the score that you need, you can then retake the test before your due date. And then how to obtain the e-firma, which I didn't know existed until I applied for this. Right. So Cambridge University, like UNAM, is a massive university. There's loads and loads of departments, all of which have maybe partially overlapping research subjects. For example, pathology is classically where you find all your immunology folks doing, host pathogen interactions, T cell, B cell biology, and so on. A lot of those people are also in the Department of Medicine, which is classically formed for kind of the study of human medicine, but is now expanded from there. So I'm technically within this department, and so the work basically varies from department to department. Just make sure you're looking at individual PIs and what their work is. But just keep in mind, kind of the university is massive. There's these things called, if you're interested, particularly in immunology, which is kind of my area, there's this kind of cross-departmental body, if you will, called CITID, which is kind of the Cambridge Immunology Infectious Diseases kind of department, if you will, and they've got lots of PIs from across several departments, mostly through the Department of Medicine, but but it's a really useful place to look for PIs who are doing stuff with immunology. Um, I would suggest kind of finding departments and then looking at the various research areas in each department. And so this is Department of Pathology, and then you can look at every PI within that department. And in this case, like if you're interested in T cells and cancer, you can look at the Ricciardi group. And then look at their research tab, what publications they have recently, and so on, to kind of build yourself an idea of what that lab is doing at the moment. If you're kind of wondering what their most up-to-date work is, I would probably go into PubMed, look at the most recent paper, and see what they're currently doing. But then you'd have to reach out and say, I'm interested in your work, or and so on. If you're interested in doing more bioinformatics, sequencing stuff with DNA, RNA stuff, the Sanger Institute is one of the leading world institutes, along with the Broad in MIT and Harvard. There's lots of people here doing a variety of things, all through the lens of kind of bioinformatics sequencing. Some amazing people there. If you're more interested in cancer and various aspects of cancer, CRUK, Cambridge Institute, and the Cambridge Center are two of the places that are doing that. But that's kind of not inclusive. There's lots of people doing cancer all over the university. But just to kind of give you an idea. The next step would then be to email those groups and basically do it in a personal one-to-one basis. So you would, once you find, one or two people in a department, for example, you can then email them and say, I've got an interest in your lab. And this is a typical email that I would send. I would say something like, Dear Professor or Dear Doctor, so-and-so, I hope you're well. My name is, David. I'm applying. I would like to apply kind of for a PhD in your lab. I'm currently doing this degree in this university in Mexico. This is my research experience, blah, blah, blah. Kind of keep it nice and short, but give some details. And I've added my CV for reference, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And then the important bit for if you're applying through CONACYT, it's quite important to make the PI aware of like what the process will be like. So I would then say, I'm applying for this Cambridge CONACYT scholarship. It covers 4 years of funding for Mexican students. It would be great to meet by Zoom and then discuss this in person. And then, thanks for your time and consideration, and so on. I thought I'd put some kind of some do's and don'ts for emailing etiquette, because I know it can be kind of different from country to country. I would avoid sending emails to basically every person in the department. I would pick maybe 2 or 3 people max who you're really interested in working with. It could just be seen a little bit as poor form if you're just blanket emailing people. I would not address them by Mr., Mrs., or Miss, always kind of Doctor, Professor. It always seems to affect female faculty the most, so just be aware of that. Make sure you write information that's unique or tailored to that group or to that PI. I would definitely look into, well, hopefully you should be doing some reading of at least 1 or 2 of the most recent papers of each lab that you're potentially looking at. And then I would include something about that. So if you're interested in doing, I don't know, ILC research, then say, your latest paper on I don't know, ILC development and NK cells really caught my interest. You don't have to read their whole body of work, but just make sure that you have a good taste of what they're doing. And I would avoid lying about, having read all their work if you haven't, or having an interest in them if you don't. So just make sure you're kind of tailoring it to your interests. I prefer to email as I go, but you can also make a spreadsheet if you're more organized, and make a list and then email those people in your list. You definitely need to include a CV. Cover letters are a lot more formal for formal kind of job applications. They might ask you for one and you can include it then, but until then, I think people are mostly happy with the CV. And then I'd be flexible with what research areas you're kind of applying to. And with that said so you don't necessarily have to have previous expertise in that specific area. So my bachelor's is in chemistry and biochemistry. My first research experiences are in neuroscience, but my PhD is in immunology, even though I never took immunology in university. So you don't have to be a specialist. You just have to have an interest, and have some relevant transferable experience, which I did. So just keep in mind, if you're doing a neuroscience degree now and you're interested in kind of going into neuroimmunology or doing into biochemistry, you can. That's totally a great thing to do. You should have a really nice looking CV. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be professional and needs to be clean. One of the really great resources online is this thing called Overleaf. If you don't know about it, they have all these templates for CVs, which is where I got mine. The CV should be fairly kind of, standardized. It should be very clean. You should be able to see all the areas very clearly. So education. So if you already have a bachelor's degree or you're working on it, you can, put that it's expected and the date that it's expected. You can include your grades if you're doing incredibly well. If you feel like you don't want to put them in, you don't have to. The most important thing here is selected research experience. So you definitely want to highlight any research that you've done, whether it's in part of your undergrad labs, whether it's a summer experience, any of that where you've had a job doing research in the summer, that all of that kind of should be included. If you've been fortunate enough to have some publications or some presentations, you can include those there. Even if you're knowledge on a paper, I would also include that because every experience is valuable. And to contribute to an article, even if you're not a co-author, is still a very valuable experience. And then if you have any kind of hard skills, like, if you could do a Western blot, if you can do some sequencing, if you're good at bioinformatics, you could do R, Python, if you work with mice and so on, I'd put that all in. I put my email. I normally put my phone number. And for my address, I normally put the address of my institution. I don't put my personal address, unless it's on the application platform. Okay, so once you email them, they might answer, they might not answer, depends. A lot of these PIs are really, really busy and sometimes they get hundreds of emails a day, and it might not be personal. So if they don't answer, just, wait a couple of weeks if you're really interested and then do a follow-up and just say, kindly following up on my previous email, would still be very happy to chat. Don't do it before 10 days or 2 weeks because it can seem quite impatient and they might not like that. Okay, if they don't answer after one follow-up, you can try again, but maybe you can also reach out to their PhD students or a postdoc and say, hey, what's the best way to get in touch with them? Because sometimes the emails are a bit outdated, or you can't find their email or something. Okay, if they answer yes, you can then schedule a Zoom meeting and then chat to them. When you come to chat, don't just don't expect a kind of a regular conversation. Do come prepared. Do some reading of the work that they're doing. You don't have to read every paper, but at least read the kind of the most recent one or two, to have an idea of what work they do, what techniques they do, and so on. Ask what projects they have in the lab currently. Ask about maybe their financing, their grants, how much money is allocated to the project that I'm going into. Because that's quite important, because even if you come into a group that's doing exciting work, if they don't have money for the work that you want to do, that can be quite tricky. So make sure that what the situation is there. You want to ask about their approach to mentoring. Are they hands-on? Are they hands-off? Are they really busy? Are they in the office every day? And so on. Just to see that kind of for you, that style of working is compatible with you. And if you're a person who's really independent and they're really hands-on, you might find that difficult. So just it's worth chatting and during the Zoom meeting. Do they send things, do they send their students to conferences? How many conferences do the students publish? What do they publish? What do they do after their PhD? Those are some important things to know before you decide to sign up with somebody for a PhD. Okay, once that's kind of done and the PI is like, yes, I'm happy to take you into the group. I'm happy to help you apply for this scholarship. You can then apply. So this is kind of my application portal. So you Google things like Cambridge Medicine PhD application, and so this is the PhD that I have. But there's lots of other PhDs depending on the department. So if you're applying to Department of Medicine, you want to apply to a PhD in medicine. If you're applying to the SITSIT PhD program, that's a separate one. If you're applying to pathology, that's a separate one, and so on. There's all the university websites look like this. There'll be an apply now button here, which you can start basically anytime, and you can save the application. And it'll tell you what the deadlines are. It'll also tell you what the requirements are for the application. And that those are quite simple, surprisingly. Just need two academic references. One of them should be from somebody you've done research with. Another one could be a character reference or an academic reference from university. You'll need a transcript, and there's a specific kind of mark that you need. I think you need a 2-1, which is I think un ocho, un ocho cinco. I'm not really sure. Um, you'll need a CV, which hopefully you already have, and then you'll need evidence of competence in English, which comes to the IELTS or a TOEFL exam. Even though I've been talking about Cambridge, about CONACYT, there's other scholarships available, and this is through this organization called the Cambridge Trust. And what the Cambridge Trust is, it's basically an organization that has been providing scholarships and funding for university students for ages. They have lots of scholarships for international people. If you go into the Cambridge Trust website, shown here, you can then put in your country, the degree you want to study, and then I'll give you all the scholarships. And here there's 19 for any level. If you put PhD, there might be fewer, there might be more. But just make sure you go and look at that. So, and the reason why I bring it up is because when you apply to Cambridge, you can basically click a button and you'll apply to all the eligible ones. And so that makes your chances of getting some funding better. Once you kind of have that on the wraps, you want to start looking at the CONACYT scholarship. So I Google convocatorias CONACYT doctorado extranjero. It'll open there, and then you can select either doctorado directo or doctorado indirecto if you don't have a master's degree, which I didn't at the time. You'll make a CV único and an application portal for CONACYT, and all your applications will be here. CONACYT requires a lot of things. A few of them have to come from Cambridge, and this is why it's important to reach out to the PI and establish an agreement first. So the first thing that you'll need is the definitive letter of acceptance from the university, and they send this to you when you've been accepted. The second thing is this anteproyecto de investigación, which is a research proposal, and this you can craft with your PI. The CV from your PI that's been signed, highlighting the most recent kind of publications, the most recent conferences and so on. And then the last one is 3 letters of recommendation, one of which should be from your PI. And this is not a regular letter of rec. It's a downloadable form, basically where they grade you from 1 to 10, that you can get from CONACYT, and it's in English, and you can just download them, send them to them, receive them, and then upload them to your portal. You'll need a number of other things, but those are from either your home institution or kind of just things like your letter to come back to the country and lots of other things. You'll put them all into this massive portal on CONACYT, and they're really, really strict with this. So you want to make sure that you have every single document that they require, because if you're missing anything, they will just reject your application immediately without considering it. So if, like, for example, when I uploaded my diploma, I only scanned one side of it because the other side was blank, and they rejected that document and said that it needed to be scanned on both sides, even though one was blank. And so things like that kind of just tell you how bureaucratic the process are. So you want to make sure that you have everything kind of down to a T. Okay, and then the research proposal is really, really critical, because they're grading your application based on your CV, your grades, your experience, what university you've been accepted into, and in this case, being that it's Cambridge is really likely that they'll give you the funding, but you need to make sure that your research proposal is also spot on. I asked for help, and my boss now helped me do this one. So this was about looking at tissue resident B cells in the brain and their role in that. And so we wrote a little background with a bit of literature, the hypothesis that we're kind of pursuing, the experimental plan, and 4 questions, and 4 research questions here at the end. And so it's very, very simple, very clean, and a very clear research proposal. So it doesn't have to be kind of your magnus opus, but it does have to be very presentable. And so make sure you ask your potential PI for help with this. Yeah, basically that's it. If you have any questions, I can answer them now. If you have further questions, you can reach out by email. Um, Basically, the most important thing to consider with this application is that you need to kind of gather the support from the PI and tell them in this first meeting that you have with them, this is how we'd apply. I'd get 4 years of funding, but I need your kind of your letter of rec and um, uh, a signed copy of your CV, and I need the acceptance letter from the university before I can even apply to the funding. And so normally if you're applying, when you're applying to the PhD program, you can write down the name of the PI that you want to work with, and that will get sent to them, and they'll be able to kind of move the application forward with you. It's fairly straightforward, but it really is dependent on you kind of pushing every aspect of the application and the process, because CONACYT can be quite unresponsive with their communications. And so it's good to start early. Yeah, with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta? Yo tengo una pregunta con la parte más que me compete a mí de investigador, o sea, colaboraciones directas con,
Sí.
o sea, ¿hay algún tipo de grants colaborativas internacionales de esta Cambridge Trust?
No estoy seguro. Normalmente el Cambridge Trust son muy generosos con sus fondos. Em, yo creo que estarían ellos como, bueno, obvio no puedo hablar de su parte, pero normalmente hay muchos como pots de dinero en Cambridge, y más en el sistema de colegios. Hay mucho dinero que está como guardado para proyectos de EDI y de democratización de ciencia y de oportunidades. Entonces, a través de eso, normalmente en mi experiencia hay mucho dinero ahí, pero nada más tienes que averiguar como la forma de cómo pedir el dinero y cómo hacer como el pitch para que ellos digan, esto nos conviene a nosotros también, y entonces vamos a poner el dinero. Entonces yo cuando hace unos años me traje unos estudiantes de Morelia, de universidad, me traje a 4 estudiantes en 2 veranos, y saqué el dinero. La Universidad de México pagó por sus pasajes de avión y por su estipendio por el verano, pero la universidad, o sea, mi lab pagó por todas las cosas del lab para ellas, y pedí al colegio que les pagara pues la renta. Entonces, la renta fue gratuita. Entonces, como pidiendo dinero como en partes, es como se pueden armar esas organizaciones más fácilmente. También hay dinero como por parte de Embo, para hacer como contratos de 6 meses o a veces hasta más, donde puedes mandar a uno de tus estudiantes de doctorado de México a Europa o Estados Unidos, y tenerlos ahí, tener todo ese dinero pagado. Y eso yo creo que es un poco más fácil de sacar, porque puedes hacer un convenio con uno de los PIs con los que colaboras normalmente y decir, pues te mando un estudiante, juntos metemos una aplicación para uno de estos short-term grants, y yo he visto muchos PIs que hacen eso y les va muy bien.
Sí, algo que discutíamos antes de que empezara la transmisión es que sería bueno que los estudiantes estuvieran al tanto de todas estas oportunidades que hay en
Ujú,
Europa, digamos, de, o sea, dinero o becas o fundaciones o las mismas instituciones, pueden ser universidades directamente o centros de investigación, que tienen dinero asignado específicamente para minorías y para,
ujú.
pues sí,
Sí.
underrepresented areas, ¿no? Geográficas.
Ujú,
México cae en eso. Y
ujú.
a lo mejor sería bueno, no sé si el mismo posgrado o alguien podría hacer como un compendio de ese tipo de ligas, donde los estudiantes pueden buscar ese tipo de becas, no solo para irse a Reino Unido, para Alemania, para otros lados.
Sí,
También
sí,
sé
pues.
que al menos el posgrado de biomédicas sí tiene esta colaboración con una universidad en Holanda. Y de hecho
Ujú,
parte de este convenio, ya con universidad, o sea, UNAM con la universidad holandesa, es que se establezcan colaboraciones en las que estudiantes de aquí vayan o estudiantes de allá vengan, y eso refuerza las colaboraciones entre grupos de investigación, pero además también les da a los chicos la oportunidad de tener sí o sí una estancia en el extranjero y creo que es una experiencia muy valiosa que pues, los chicos tendrían que aprovechar, ¿no? Y, bueno,
Sí, sí,
primero
sí.
enterarse, porque creo que esas cosas, como que si no las preguntas, nadie te dice, ¿no?
Sí, exacto, y cien por
Por ahí
ciento.
David tiene una pregunta.
Hola, hola, ¿qué tal?
Hola.
¿Qué tal? Pues una pregunta, quizá pues un poco, pues, pues ver qué, qué tan importante consideras que se requiere de conocer el idioma y, y si, bueno, digamos que no se maneje mucho, ¿qué tanto influye en poder aplicar alguna de estas becas, digamos?
Pues siéndote 100% honesto, tienes que tener un... El idioma yo creo que es la base y lo más importante. O sea, vas a tener que comunicarte con gente en el lab, eh, dando, o sea, si te toca dar la meeting cada mes o algo así, todo eso va a ser en inglés. Entonces, aparte de navegar todo lo de la ciencia y todo lo de la vida de doctorado, que es ya súper complicado, hacerlo en otro idioma, pues también lo complica. Entonces... No tienes que tener inglés perfecto, es 0% la verdad, y no quiero como comunicar eso. Lo que sí tienes que tener es un nivel trabajable, o sea, tienes que tener la capacidad de poder hablar con gente en el trabajo, que tú entiendas y que ellos te entiendan, y eso es lo primordial. Y si no tienes ese nivel, la verdad sí es muy complicado. Sí se puede hacer porque yo he visto mucha gente que el nivel de inglés no es óptimo, pero eso, para mí eso sería pues muy difícil y sí se te complica la vida. Aparte de eso, tienes que tener un nivel de inglés para hacer el examen del IELTS porque el CONACYT y la Universidad de Cambridge te piden un score del IELTS como de 6 o 6.5 algo así, am, que es, yo creo que es como un nivel B2, B2, B1. Am, entonces, si puedes pasar eso y no te sientes cómodo con tu inglés, eso es otra cosa, pero no tienes que tener el inglés perfecto llegando allá. Obviamente vas a mejorar mucho, pero si no puedes pasar como el examen, no vas a poder ni siquiera solicitar.
Vale, gracias.
Sí, de nada.
Yo nomás quiero agregar algo a esa respuesta.
Ujú.
Creo que en las universidades, sobre todo universidades grandes o famosas, no importa en qué lugar de Europa estén, o sea, en este caso obviamente Reino Unido pues es inglés, pero si van a Alemania o si van a, no sé, Holanda, si son universidades así como más reconocidas, lo más probable es que se hable en inglés en el laboratorio, porque tienen una diversidad de estudiantes de muchas nacionalidades. Y entonces, a lo mejor no necesariamente les puedo compartir la experiencia de uno de mis alumnos que se fue a Alemania. No se fue sabiendo alemán, se fue sabiendo inglés, o sea, un nivel de inglés lo suficientemente bueno para comunicarse, para pues lidiar con la cotidianidad, porque eso también tienen que pensarlo. A lo mejor,
Sí.
obviamente, los mueve la parte científica, pero tienen que vivir ahí y poder pedir agua, y, o sea, lo básico tienen que saberlo, ¿no? Entonces, y sobre todo si van a lugares pequeños, ¿no? Si son pueblos chicos, pues lo más probable es que tengan que aprender el idioma para el día a día, pero a
Ujú.
nivel académico es muy probable que se maneje el inglés y que con eso baste para de entrada poder aplicar y poder sobrevivir sin problema en este laboratorio en el extranjero, ¿no?
Sí, 100%. Y o sea, no tiene que ser un inglés como 100% bilingüe y no tienes que hablarlo sin acento. O sea, todos como dice Paula, en estos ambientes todo el mundo es súper de todos los países y todos tienen acentos súper diferentes y mucha gente tiene un acento muy pesado, pero vas a tener y eso es 100% aceptable con que puedas tú entender y que te des a entender. Eso es lo único importante. Así que... Y eso se puede mejorar y, o sea, viviendo en un país donde hablas inglés, pues se mejora, pero tienes que tener el nivel para sacar el examen, para sacar ese puntaje en el examen. Y eso es lo primordial. Y entonces, si te sientes que no tienes ese nivel, pues empieza a practicar para el examen y una vez que pases eso, pues ya puedes mejorar.
Daniel hizo.
¿Alguna otra pregunta de aplicación, de cómo hablar con PIs,
Ana,
de vivir en Cambridge?
Ana Pau Escobar.
Eh,
Ah,
sí,
hola.
No, perdón, va
hola.
Daniel. Perdón, es que
Ah,
como
bueno,
bajó la
ok.
manita pensé que ya no quería. Perdón, vamos en orden.
Ah, no, la bajé porque justo dijo mi nombre. Una disculpa. Sí, yo tenía una duda sobre la beca.
Ujú.
Estoy ahorita revisando como por encima todo lo bueno, lo del CONACYT y tenía una duda. ¿Esta beca que mencionas cubre una parte de la colegiatura o cubre toda la colegiatura o también te da como para vivir allá un
Sí,
poco?
muy buena pregunta y se me olvidó remarcarlo. Esto es lo muy bonito de, o sea, las becas de CONACYT te puedes ir a cualquier universidad del mundo. Bueno, no tiene que ser top 200 pero te puedes ir a Stanford, te puedes ir a donde sea. Pero lo especial de irte a Cambridge es que el Cambridge Trust tiene un convenio con CONACYT, donde el CONACYT te cubre todos los fees de bueno, de 3, 4 años, depende, en la universidad, o sea, la colegiatura, y te cubre 4 años de estipendio. Pero ese estipendio son 770 libras al mes, mínimo para lo que recibo yo, que es menos de lo mínimo que dice el gobierno de Inglaterra que puedes pagarle a un estudiante. Entonces el Cambridge Trust te paga el resto. Entonces, no, la beca, el estipendio que recibes tú como para vivir y todo eso es súper suficiente para poder vivir ahí. Cambridge es caro y Oxford es caro, pero con el dinero de CONACYT y de Cambridge Trust juntos es suficiente. Y hasta tienes dinero como para pagar viajes para ir a México. O sea, a mí me tocaba regresar a México cada año y me iba a Londres a ver shows y eso. Entonces, no te vas a hacer rico, pero sí es suficiente. Aparte, lo padre del CONACYT Cambridge Trust es que el Cambridge Trust te da muchos apoyos extras. Si algo pasa y tienes una emergencia y te tienes que regresar a México, puedes pedir apoyo y te dan dinero. Me dieron dinero para una laptop a mí, que el CONACYT jamás me lo daría. O sea, ni siquiera te responden emails, menos te van a dar un apoyo extra. Am, a veces como que cosas raras pasan con la tarjeta de Conacit y se te congela y si pasa algo y no tienes dinero, el Cambridge Trust te apoyaría. Entonces, tener ese apoyo de esa organización con más dinero es súper padre y ellos responden y son súper amables y todo eso. También me dieron dinero para irme a una conferencia y me dieron como 800 libras por una conferencia o algo así, aparte de todo que me dan ya como cada mes. Entonces, sí, sí hay mucho apoyo. Aparte de eso, está el nivel del college, que son como las casas de Harry Potter. Es cada estudiante en Cambridge o en Oxford te asignan a un college automáticamente y ese college a veces también, dependiendo de cuál es, también tiene apoyos financieros. Entonces, si algo pasa y una emergencia y ocupas dinero, ellos te dan dinero y es dinero regalado, no es dinero prestado. Entonces, como financieramente, Cambridge y Oxford están muy bien como organizados como para apoyar estudiantes de bajos recursos. O sea, a mí mi college cada año me da 300 libras para comprar cosas de deporte, como para enriquecer la vida de los estudiantes. Entonces, nada más te dan cada año 300 libras y ve a gastarlo en como unos tenis nuevos o algo así. Entonces, sí, hay muchos como fondos de dinero, donde te apoyan.
Ana Pau Escobar.
Sí, hola. Yo también tengo dudas sobre la beca. O sea, no entendí bien si el Cambridge Trust, o sea, se aplica aparte
Ujú.
de lo de CONACYT.
No, no, no.
Mm.
Una vez que te aceptan a Cambridge, tú luego aplicas bueno, en uno de los botones te va a decir, si quieres aplicar a todas las becas, bla, 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 y le pones sí. Y dentro de eso cae lo de CONACYT. Pero obviamente mm, tienes que aplicar la beca de CONACYT de separada. Eso es lo único que tienes que aplicar. Una vez que te dan eso, el Cambridge Trust es automático.
Ah, ok,
Sí,
perfecto. Gracias.
sí, de nada.
Si alguien más tenga preguntas. ¿Pusiste tu correo, David, para
Eh,
contacto?
lo puse al principio,
Ah,
pero
bueno, pero pueden
cuando
ver,
las
está el video en YouTube, o sea, si tuvieran más preguntas o alguien que vea
Sí,
después el
sí,
video le
cien por
interese
ciento
contactarte, podría ponerse en contacto así, ¿no?
Sí, 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 también estoy en LinkedIn, porque me van a desactivar mi correo de Cambridge en enero porque ya me cambio de trabajo. Pero cualquier cosa, ahí estoy en LinkedIn, me mandan un mensaje. Sí hay muchos mexicanos en Cambridge y en Oxford y en Londres, entonces es una red como muy bonita, una comunidad muy bonita. Pero no sé, hacer el doctorado en Cambridge, la verdad, ha sido como un sueño, no nada más científicamente, pero la vida en college y vivir al extranjero y vivir en Inglaterra ha sido muy padre. Pero si prefieres o si estás como en duda de si te quieres ir o no te quieres ir, hay muchas formas en las que si te quedas en México para un doctorado, te puedes ir a Europa o a Estados Unidos o donde quieras, por una estancia de extranjero como de 6 meses o menos, hacer colaboraciones y luego si te quieres ir como un postdoc, te puedes ir de postdoc, como lo que hacen muchos PIs en México, se van a Yale, se van a Harvard a hacer sus postdocs super shiny, y luego se regresan y traen esos recursos a México. Y eso es lo que también es muy padre. Y una de las amigas que tenía yo en Cambridge, que hizo su PhD, su postdoc, se regresó a México y ahorita está en el IG en la UNAM, en Querétaro, donde estoy ahorita yo. Y ella tiene su grupo ahí, entonces, como no sé, hay muchas formas y muchos caminos de hacer como tu doctorado y si prefieres quedarte en México y tener como ese ámbito de colaboración con alguien, pues háblalo con tu PI pues te haces un plan que te convenga a ti, y que tú prefieras. Sí.
Bien, pues muchísimas gracias, David. Espero que esta información sea de utilidad para los estudiantes y que se aprovechen estas oportunidades, ¿no? Creo que lo más importante es que la gente sepa que existen y que pueden aplicar y que, o sea, creo que es más bien falta de difusión, ¿no?
Sí, sí,
Que
sí,
tienen estas
exactamente.
opciones, que no las desaprovechen, porque además son calls que quedan desiertas, ¿no? O sea, como no se entera la gente, nadie aplica y es dinero que está ahí para eso y nadie usa, ¿no?
Exactamente, y por eso es lo que estoy haciendo esto, porque alguien me dijo cuando yo empecé que había como 10 becas cada año y no sé si era de verdad, y sí lo confirmé que hay como 10 becas cada año para Cambridge, entonces, y se utiliza como una o dos, o sea, y estas son de maestría y de doctorado. Las de maestría no conozco muy bien, pero sí sé que te puedes ir para una maestría a Cambridge y luego quedarte para el doctorado, todo con dinero de CONACYT. Entonces, también hay otras becas como de Chevening y eso, pero sí, hay muchos recursos, nada más tienes que encontrarlos con tiempo y pues hacer la estrategia de cómo solicitar y cómo sacar esos recursos.
Bueno,
Sí.
pues gracias a
Bueno,
todos por estar aquí y a ti,
muchas
David,
gracias.
compartir esta experiencia y pues, hasta luego. Buen día.